We're going.
Very good. Welcome back, everybody. This is Two Beards in a Bible. I'm John Swano, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
You remember who you are?
I do remember, sort of, yes. I remember who I was.
Dave Tenney.
Yes.
And we are in Acts chapter 27, right?
Yeah. I guess I can start reading. I'm going to read through verse 8.
Okay.
It says, "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us, and the next day we landed in Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we put to sea, from there we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. And when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulties to Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, passing it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia, I think that says.
You got the hard name this week.
I tell you what, I didn't think I was going to get through that.
I was fully expecting that I'd be reading that. Yeah. So I went and looked up some of the names. And that in verse 7, it's Nidus. Evidently the C is silent.
Yeah, anytime you see a word that starts with CN,
yeah,
it's that's a head scratcher right there.
Yeah, right. It doesn't make sense to the English language.
No,
at least not in our time.
I don't think it makes sense in the Greek language.
Right. So yeah, I went through and tried to refresh myself, but you got it. So hey,
I'll tell you the thing. So like these last chapters 27 and 28 here, we're at the end of Acts, and most of this is narrative. Mm-hmm. And there's some stuff I think to talk about in here, but maybe not as much as we have before, because mostly this is just it's two chapters that just talk about a journey Paul made.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing that's interesting in here. There is so much detail about this trip. Mm-hmm. There is so much detail about sailing in the first century.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. It's like if you were to like, you knew how to do something and you were telling somebody about it, or you went some trip and you had all these details you were telling them about the trip. That's what this almost sounds like. It's like, okay, so Luke's writing this, and we know Luke's with him because it says in the first verse, he says, and when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, mm-hmm. we know Luke was with him because he put himself in there as the we.
Right. And this was written, from what I've looked at, it was written many years later, or several years later.
Yeah,
it was a recounting, from the past about the things that had happened. And I think Romans, was written in the 50s.
Yeah.
But Luke wrote the book of Acts. They're thinking somewhere like towards almost 70.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I forget the year range, but it was after. It was later.
Yeah.
After the fact, and that kind of when you read Paul's accounts and you read then Luke's account, from the very beginning of the book of Luke, we see that he's kind of an orderly fella. He likes to put things in the proper order and have all those details. Yeah. It sort of does speak to also that he's being led by the Holy Spirit to tell these things, because some of these details, we'd forget.
Yeah, and I think the thing I think it's interesting about that is, you can tell the truth in that he was here, and like there's no disputing that Luke was with him and that this all happened, because who would make up all these crazy details?
Yeah, and when I told you earlier that I went and looked up some of the crazy names that we're reading here, and that led me down a rabbit hole, and I started looking at the maps. I started to punch up these cities on the maps and kind of followed the path that he would have taken, and very, very interesting. And those places exist.
Yeah,
And
there was a guy who wrote a book, I believe, in the 1800s. It was about boating, yachting, or whatever it was called back then. And he went on this journey, and he said in the book, he's like, yeah, everything that Luke wrote is there. And in fact, where they end up being at the end in Malta is today called St. Paul's Bay.
exactly, yeah. I was going to mention that.
When we got to it?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's good. We'll mention it again.
Yes, we will.
But yeah, it's definitely part of that. In college, I might have mentioned before that Angela and I went to Italy, and in part of our trip, we went down into that area.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually took a boat, and we came up towards Rome. I think we actually went towards where Mount Vesuvius is, and landed there, and then took roads up to Rome. But much the same way as Paul did. I mean, a little bit of a different track. He started down further south on the Italian peninsula there to come up. But interesting, and being able to think of being out on the sea in that area and so on, and even in the summer, the wind was swift.
Was it beautiful?
It was beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was much bluest water I've ever seen.
Wow.
And so he had a lot of fun things to look at there.
Absolutely.
But it does say he was dealing with winter weather and bad weather.
Well, I'll tell you about the things that I know. Mm-hmm. So we've got this guy named Julius, who's a centurion of the Augustan regiment. Well, in history, there was an Augustan, there's secular history that says that there was an Augustan regiment at this time. Doesn't list the people that were in it, but obviously this Bible lists Julius as being one that was in it. He mentions some other people here, this Aristarchus of Macedonia, and Paul mentions him in other writings too. I believe in Ephesians he's mentioned, although I did not write that down, and if I'm wrong, I apologize in advance. The next thing I notice is Julius gave Paul liberty. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem like the thing you would do to a prisoner.
Right. And when you think back to what we had read in the last episode, in his appeal to Agrippa, it's in verse 32 of Acts 26, it says, then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar.
Right.
So there was this understanding that he really hadn't done anything.
Right.
And this Julius probably was privy to
that
conversations, and was probably there, and
right,
and would have likely understood that, and so gave him a little bit of freedom, understanding that he's not really a dangerous prisoner. Right. He's someone that's caught up in a political battle.
Yeah, he was not your average prisoner.
Right.
So he had some different, what would you call those? Liberties, I guess, that other prisoners would certainly have never gotten.
Right.
And then he just goes and tells about all the different places, and it sounds like they had some rough winds, and they came into some place called Fair Havens, which sounds like a real nice place to stay, and that's where they stopped, and that's where we pick up. Mm-hmm. So you want to read? Oh, you get the easy section. How about 9 through 12?
All right. So starting at verse 9. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. and because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there.
Okay, so the good thing is we can tell what time of year this happened. But because he says because the fast was already over, which was the Day of Atonement, which happened sometime between the end of September and beginning of October. If you're listening to this as it's being released, that was a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm glad you got those math skills.
Yes. so that's basically what we know. So the Day of Atonement. And the other thing is I read historically, most people in this region after the middle of September, they didn't sail because the winds were crazy, I guess, at that time of year.
Right.
It was dangerous. And Paul advised them not to sail.
Right.
But did they listen to Paul?
No. They learned their lesson. But
Yeah.
I was thinking about that, and there in verse 11, that the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship. I guess logically that makes sense.
Yeah.
These fellows are sailors, and they know what they're doing, so we should be able to trust them that we can make it.
Yeah, who am I going to address? The guy who sails for a living or some random Jewish prisoner dude?
Right.
Right? I'm not going to trust him.
Right.
Although I should, but
Right. And as the journey goes on, I think that his mind changes a little bit.
oh yeah, absolutely. And then it says that the harbor was not suitable to winter in, and I guess geographically that harbor was wide open. So if you've got a ship, so it says that they sailed from Alexandria, which would have been like Egypt. And Egypt, and we find this out later too by reading, but Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. That's where all of the wheat from Rome came from. So that's what this ship was. They were exporting wheat from Alexander in Egypt and taking it to Rome. And that's why we'll read later if they threw the wheat overboard.
Right.
Because that's what they would have been doing. But if you got if you have this big, huge boat with all this weight on it, and you're in this wide open harbor where there's a lot of wind,
Right.
and it's going to cause havoc with that boat, that's probably why they didn't want to harbor there.
Right. Yeah, and there might be some of the grizzled old sailors, perhaps. Maybe they had been through some storms and felt themselves worthy opponents to.
They
to
probably
nature.
said, "Oh well, if we leave the boat here, we could have all kinds of problems."
Yeah.
So they just decided, "Well, we're going to gamble."
Well, in our lives, we make those decisions, and,
Yeah.
and sometimes we regret them. But I suppose to give them a pass, they were operating on the things that they knew at the time.
Yep, absolutely. Start on verse 13. Oh boy, more big words. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous head wind arose called Euroclidean? Sounds like something out of Star Wars. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now when neither the sun or stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Okay, so I'll stop there and talk about that stuff.
Not like they could call the Coast Guard.
Right. Now, there's like, some nautical things in there that, I'm not Kevin Mellinger would be the guy to have here, a
Right.
friend of ours who sails.
Right.
He could explain some of this stuff to us better.
Well, the one thing that they, talking about throwing the ship's tackle overboard, that,
So how are they going to catch fish? They
it
throw
could
their
be
tackle
that, but
box.
what I'm thinking of is like the control, the pulleys and the blocks and the tackle, that you would use to hoist the sail
ropes.
and those things. So to me, that kind of reads like they're just at the whim of nature. They understand that, so they've lightened the ship so they don't sink, and they've kind of given up on being able to control the ship as much.
Yeah, absolutely. So what else it says? It says that neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's like some miraculous thing. I think it was just so cloudy. I mean, I know like around here in the wintertime, there will be days where you can't see the sun,
right?
Because of the cloud cover.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we have such cloud cover is because of our proximity to Lake Erie.
Yeah.
So it's understandable.
Yep. Because we got water.
Right. And this Euroclydon, however you pronounce it, I looked that up, and it's a strong northeast cyclonic wind that happens during the fall and the winter in that area. So it's a known...
It's a thing.
A known thing.
Yeah.
And a cyclonic wind. That, that leads you to believe it's something akin to a hurricane. So that would make sense with there being cloudy weather for days.
Yeah.
It would make sense that you probably wouldn't want to be found sailing in such a thing.
Yeah, that reminded me of there was some term that they used in Star Wars about, and I don't remember. I'm not a big Star Wars guy, but there was some term that they used about something that made Jedis, and it sounded like Euroclidians. It was I don't know what it is. I can't think of it. Somebody out there is screaming it at me right now.
Right.
But I can't hear you.
And almost everybody of our generation watched that.
Yes.
Ad nauseum, but
yeah,
I've probably only seen it once or twice myself. So.
Some of those movies I've never seen all the way through in one sitting.
Yeah,
but I've seen pieces of them because my kids watched them a million times. So neither sun nor stars appeared, and that was a problem because that's how they navigated.
Right.
They didn't have like GPS.
Right.
Siri, where's the shore at? Right.
We take for granted how easily we can navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. So, John, why don't you read from 21 to 26?
All right, starting verse 21. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid. Paul, you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island.
Okay, stop there. Okay. It says after a long absence of food, why weren't they eating?
Well, I would imagine being tossed around, you probably didn't have an appetite, and if you did eat, you might hurl it up.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. And I think like just the stress of the whole situation, you're probably not going to eat either.
Right.
So
and that turns into a a nasty situation, because if you're not eating, you're losing strength. You kind of lose your wits.
Yeah.
About you. You start to, after a certain amount of time, you start to hallucinate and lose your mind if you don't have nourishment.
And you might be seasick to boot.
Right.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of things going on.
Recipe for disaster.
Yeah. So Paul tells them to take heart. So he's going to give them like the pep talk. And it's funny how he starts off. He goes, Men and brethren, I told you so.
Right. Right.
He had to start off that way.
Right. And that's, it's that way for so many of us when we set out on our own understanding. A lot of times we realize we should have just
Yeah.
listen to the scriptures, in our case.
Yep. So now Paul reiterates again. He tells them about the God whom he serves. And of course, a lot of those people would probably been, pagans, I would imagine. A lot of these Roman soldiers. And he says that, he's got to be brought before Caesar. And he says that everybody's going to live, but they're going to run aground on a certain island.
Right.
Okay.
And there again, imagine the thoughts going through people's minds when he says, "For there stood by me this night an angel of the God that I serve."
Yeah.
So there might have been some of them that were like, "Well, he's lost it."
Yeah. Yes.
But they were seeing the things going on around them, and by all accounts, they probably should have been dead.
Yeah.
Yet they were preserved.
I have a feeling by the whole end of this ordeal, there were some of those who believed.
You would think so.
I would imagine. Verse 27, it says, "Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest they should run on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship when they let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall." Okay.
So there's some belief coming about with the soldiers.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
They're starting to listen.
Yeah, they're starting to. At the beginning there, so we find out it's been like 14 days since they left. And it says they took soundings. Mm-hmm. I had to look this up because I don't know anything about nautical stuff.
Right.
I was like, oh, are they like yelling at the shore and seeing how long their echo comes? I had no idea what that. But apparently, what that is they would take like a rope with a weight on it, and they would drop it over the side, and they would let it out, and they would measure the bottom of the ocean floor with it.
Okay.
So that's what soundings were.
Oh.
So when he says they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, a fathom's about 6 feet. So it's about 120 feet. And then when they found 15 fathoms, that's about 90 feet. Mm-hmm. So that's just telling you how far under them the ocean floor is.
And that's telling them that they're likely getting closer to some land.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's starting to go up. I don't know. I mean, 90 feet still seems pretty deep to me. Mm-hmm. But
I guess the shelves, they come up pretty quick, I think.
Yeah,
probably. In a lot of cases.
Probably. Yeah, I think about going 90 feet, man, that's a long way off. But
right.
But maybe it isn't, And then we've got these soldiers that are trying to get out of Dodge. Mm-hmm. And they got caught.
Right.
So it sounds like it says they were under the pretense of putting out anchors. Sounds like there was a little conspiracy going on that they had,
That's a good point. I didn't catch that. So yeah, they were trying to. There were like 270 some people on this boat, and so they're putting out anchors to reassure the people, and then they were gonna jump out the other side and take off.
Yeah. The only problem is Paul noticed it. Mm-hmm. So whether he was guided by the Holy Spirit to know this thing, which I would imagine. So Paul says to the centurion, who I imagine he's talking about Julius here, he says, "Hey, look what's going on, and if you don't put a stop to this, nobody's going to make it."
Yeah.
So sounds like they listened to Paul after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a lot of tumult. I guess there's a point coming up that we'll make after we read a little bit further.
You want to read to 38?
Okay, starting at verse 32.
Yep.
Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as the day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged, and also took food themselves. And in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea.
All right. So that lets us know what they were carrying.
Yeah.
So it was a boat full of wheat.
Yeah.
And I think about, I've fooled around hand harvesting a little bit of wheat just to see what it was like. That's a lot of work. And you think about all of the labor that went in to gather all of that wheat, and
Right.
it'd have been just painful to throw that whole cargo out.
Oh, certainly. Because, the guys that own the ship, they're not getting paid.
No,
When they get back.
they're losing money.
Yeah.
This could ruin them financially, probably.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, it's unlikely that the owners had a fleet of ships and a huge company to absorb the loss.
Right. Absolutely.
This is just probably a single guy
Yep.
and
Absolutely.
his crew.
So now they're encouraged and they're going to eat. Mm-hmm. So Paul says to take some nourishment, and I think that goes to your point that
Yeah.
they need all the strength they can get.
Right. And when you think biologically, how long can you go without eating?
Well, Jesus went 40 days and 40 nights,
Right.
and others have too. So
Right.
that's possible.
Right. But these guys had probably not eaten very well even before
Right.
that 14 days. So there comes this place where Paul is realizing that that they need to eat. Maybe he was also led by the Holy Spirit to tell them that as well.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the idea that no hair should fall from their heads is another interesting idea. And
Yeah.
as we see this unfold, and we see that there are those that act, but primarily Julius, makes some decisions along the way that are in alignment with the will of the Lord.
I've got a point we'll make after the next section, keeping that in mind.
Okay.
Something I think it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe we're pointing at the same thing. Well, you share your
No,
story, and I'll tell you if that's what I was thinking.
No, I'll let you go first, since you already said it first. So I'm going to read till the end of the chapter, starting at verse 39. It says, "When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, into which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go to the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosening the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them could swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land." Mm-hmm. Now, what's your point?
Well, the in verse 43, the centurion wanting to save Paul kept them from their purpose, and meaning that the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners,
Right.
so that they wouldn't escape. That would have been the normal end for
Yeah.
the prisoners in such a situation, because they couldn't possibly contain them, after
Right,
the shipwreck.
yeah.
So saving any getaway and escape their fate, they would just kill them. And Paul being numbered among them, I find it interesting, through as I was mentioning just a moment ago, through perhaps the providence of God, this Julius had this favor on Paul, which turned out to help save the rest of the people, which
Yes.
it was sort of, if you want to call it prophesied, it was told
Yeah.
to Paul that all of them would be,
They would all make it.
yeah.
the thing that I think is interesting about this is, so they're all going to make it, but it says Paul kept them from their purpose. Now this is Paul, and commanded those who could swim should jump overboard first to land, and the rest some on board and some on parts of the ship. So Paul says here, he organizes everybody. Here's how you're going to make it. Those people that can swim, you've got to swim. And if you can't, you do this and you do that.
Right.
We have to, if God said that we're all going to make it, that's what he said. But we have to, he's not going to like pick us up and carry us to shore. Man, that is a big cat.
He just fell.
He just
He
fell.
just fell off the chair.
John's got a big old black cat, and
He was sleeping on the chair and he just fell off
he
backwards.
just rolled off. You ever fall out of the bed?
Not in a long time.
Me neither. but I find it interesting that it's just like Noah. You know, Noah had to build the ark.
Right.
You know, we have to cooperate with God in order for things to work out sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be perhaps our inclination to believe that if God is going to save us, he's going to save us in the lap of luxury.
Right.
He's going to send an ocean liner to save us.
Yeah.
You know, but these guys had to float
Yeah.
on boards.
And the lesson is that we've got to do what we can do, right?
Yeah.
We've got to do everything that we can do.
Right.
And God will take care of the stuff that we can't do.
Yeah. If we keep our, again, to bring it around to today, if we keep our eyes focused on the goal,
Yeah.
then God will take care of the rest.
Absolutely.
It may not be comfortable,
Yep.
but it'll be taken care of. All right, so I see
Yep.
your
Yep.
finger on the button. It's time
Yep.
to go. So we'll stop talking. Thanks for joining in. We'll pick up next time at Acts 28.